All right, I can see I don't even need to invite our guests. As you can see, they are so keen to jump on the stage, even though it's 1.5 meters above ground. Not an easy task. You've got to be fit to perform from this stage, I suppose. So, here, please welcome for the panel discussion, we have Bill McMahon, Chief Analytics and Digital Officer at Sumitomo Pharma America. We have Ruth Coleman, Investment Manager at Mercia Ventures. We have Miriam Santer, Co-founder and COO at Theblood, the Smart Period Blood GmbH. Joanna Soroka, Principal at Hitachi Ventures. And last but not least, Guy Spiegelman, EMEA Lead Healthcare and Life Sciences Startups, Amazon Web Services. Ready, steady, go.
Great, thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. And look, we're sort of in the after-lunch shift over here, so thank you for being here and listening. We hope to make it interesting for you. My name is Guy Spiegelman. I am the EMEA lead for healthcare and life science startups at Amazon Web Services. And before we begin and before I introduce our panelists, I want to say what a privilege it all is for all of us in this room, on the stage, out there, to be engaged in healthcare and life science innovation. Because essentially, it doesn't matter how we are approaching or how we're contributing to innovation, whether we're a founder of a startup, an investor, a big pharma, big tech, a clinician, a hospital, a regulator. We all have one job to get done. One job. And that's to shorten the time to clinical value. Because if we can all come together and develop that new therapeutic in 3 years, let's say, instead of 10 years for a rare or orphan disease. Now, if it's your child and it's a rare and orphan disease, you don't care that it's called rare. You just want a solution, right? So if we can do that, using machine learning and using finance and using innovation and using grit and using everything that we have, in 3 years instead of 7 years, that's 7 years of people with the diagnosis that now may have some hope. And I think that's the tasks that we all have from however we're approaching it. And even if it's not developing therapeutics and it's about making access to care better and we're getting to more people and it's more equitable, that's also shortening time to clinical value. So it's a great opportunity, and the panel that we're talking about today is part of that journey. We're talking about real-world evidence or real-world data that's out there and how that is going to contribute to R&D and to pharmaceutical R&D. And in order to provide insight, I'm really, really pleased to welcome to the stage, or we've already been welcomed to the stage, but welcome to the start of the panel, our esteemed guests over here. I'm very happy that it's also a female majority panel. That's not the case all day today, so my next panel in a couple of hours is a manel, unfortunately. But today I'm very happy. So Joanna, do you want to start and introduce yourself, please, to the audience, and we'll get going?
Hi, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. My name is Joanna Soroka. I'm a principal at Hitachi Ventures, and we are a corporate venture arm for Hitachi, investing across industries, including healthcare, platform first, analytics first, data first. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks. Miriam.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Miriam. I'm from the startup side, so I'm a founder of a company called Theblood. And what we do is that we want to make use of menstruation as the sample itself. So we want to make it analyzable in laboratory settings. So what we build is first a D2C product for women to have access to test their menstrual blood at home. But it's also super interesting, especially the results that we get and the data that we get, to use in clinical studies for further detection for chronic conditions and maybe even in a pharma context. Yeah.
Thank you. Ruth.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here. I'm Ruth. I'm an investor at Mercia Ventures. So we're a UK-based venture capital firm. We've 800 million assets under management. We invest, we're one of the most active early-stage investors in the UK, investing seed, Series A mainly, up to 10 million in check size. And we have a strong focus on life sciences and health tech in general. And that is one of my main focus areas.
And Bill, thank you. Please introduce yourself.
Yes, I am Bill McMahon. I'm Chief Analytics and Digital Officer of Sumitomo Pharma America. As a pharmaceutical company, we are avid consumers of real-world data. Doctors frequently complain, as you heard in the previous panel, about having to do a lot of entry of data we have to make multi-hundred millions of dollar decisions on what indications that we should focus on. And a lot of that is now driven by the real-world data ecosystem.
Okay, so before we get going, let's just sort of set a baseline here. When we talk about real-world evidence or real-world data, what are we actually talking about? What does it include? Do you want to just pick up on that and start with that, Bill?
Sure, I'll speak to it briefly. But so in the past, when so I came into Pharma about 7 years ago. Prior to that, I was in the semiconductor industry. When I tried to hire people who are real-world data scientists, people earlier than a certain generation would refer to the surveys that they do either to doctors and patients to understand the experience of the patients in the real world. More recently, it typically refers to electronic claims and/or electronic health records and all of the data that's associated with the payments and the labs that patients experience with their doctors and their payers.
Okay. Anyone else want to jump in and add to what comprises real-world evidence and real-world data?
Yeah, I think of it as real-world data as being something that is gathered that's not in a clinical trial scenario, i.e. out in the wild. And when I think of real-world data versus real-world evidence, I suppose data is, the electronic health records, the pharma registries, the NHS registries, the information coming from wearables data, and then the evidence part is providing that insights piece. So the real-world evidence part is kind of providing that analytics part onto the actual real-world data to get that kind of next level of information.
Okay, well, I think that's great. Unless you have something to contribute, we might move on to the next question and what we're going to talk about. So, and Bill, you started to mention this, but maybe someone else wants to pick up on it. How's it traditionally being collected, and how's it being utilized, or let's say underutilized, perhaps?
Well, I can start with this one. I think digital data collected in hospitals, in provider side are basically kind of ad hoc events when the patient visits the facility, gets the examination. This data is collected, has been traditionally collected in multiple different centers. Very often, we heard in a previous panel, not interconnected. So we have a plethora of data that is there, not necessarily centered around the patient. And I think we have also now the explosion of the digital data, so patient-reported data. And this is through both different connected devices, and we have now also clinical-grade different wearables that are collecting in a more continuous way data around the patient. And especially also in the COVID, also remote visits, remote monitoring of patient has become more prominent. So I think we have these different types of data, and there is a different level of fragmentation of that data. And it's been collected through multiple different types of devices, sources, in a continuous, non-continuous way.
So Miriam, maybe you want to contribute here, because you're sort of adding a new data set or new data category. How long has, taking data from menstrual blood, how long has that been part of medical research, and how's it been used in the past, or not really, but maybe share some insights on that, because it really is quite innovative from my perspective anyway.
Yeah, there's not that much research out there yet. So there's just a handful of publications showing what you can do with menstrual blood, and that there's some insights, looking into there are very unique proteins to the sample, stem cell research, then the research for fertility and diagnostic space, especially for chronic conditions for women. So there's not that much that we can rely on, and there's a lot that we have to build ourselves. And I think especially when you look into data in general, the most important thing is what type of data is it that you want to get. And we have, a massive amount of data available, but what is it really that is so interesting and that you want to look into? And what we, first now need to establish is to prove menstrual blood is really useful, and then we take for example, a comparison of regular blood samples with menstrual blood samples, and we run a clinical study to prove that there are correlations. And based on that correlations, we can look into reference values for different biomarkers. But yeah, if we're going into the diagnostic space and we look for novel biomarker detection, it's a much longer process even.
Okay, I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned biomarker detection. Everyone knows what a biomarker is in the room? Anyone not know? Don't be shy. All right, so a biomarker is just a marker, like a blood test, that provides an objective point, a biological point, that gives us an indication that you have some sort of disease. Would that be a fair sort of, and that, what we're seeing though is because of real world evidence and sort of correlation. So for example, there was a stage before talking about nutrition and the amount of startups involved with microbiome, for example. Here we have a whole new world which is coming to bear. No one mentioned here genomics yet, genomics data. Is genomics real world data? Would you say that it is?
Yes, but I think it's a little less commonly used in an aggregate way. I think the challenge with genomics is the whole pseudonymization and concerns about pseudonymization. So it's a little, and it's a bit more of an expensive test. So it's among the things that we use, but it's not as aggressively used, I would say, for the types of epidemiology done within pharma that, at least at my company.
I think one of the things that is enabling that genomic space to kind of be used more in a real-world evidence situation is the biobanks that are getting built up. I know the UK has one with, I think it's 500,000 people of their genomic detail there, and you can apply to get access to that. I think there's an even bigger one in Austria. So as we see more and more of those kind of data aggregation type of scenarios, I think that'll enable us to be able to use genomics data more frequently in a real-world evidence kind of scenario.
I mean, it's multi-omics, really. It's not just it's microbiome, it's genomics, proteomics. It's all these areas now. And like, if you think about it, Bill, something you said before was real-world evidence was, patients and clinicians would fill out a few forms and there we go. There's our real-world evidence, right? And so, and I think I've seen a slide somewhere that we use it at AWS when we're talking about the explosion of healthcare data and the challenge that brings just in terms of organizing your data infrastructure and everything else. And then we'll talk about regulation as well. But we're going from these forms to literally millions of data points per patient. And then if you add monitoring of new areas, for example, menstrual blood, or if we're talking about wearables, wow, that's a big challenge. Has anyone come across companies or startups trying to use the multiple around data and then maybe linking that to the topic at hand, which is how is this starting to impact R&D processes?
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. So,
sure.
So when we're looking at potential indications to pursue, particularly in discovery phase, nowadays what you can do, there's plenty of these biobanks available. You're looking at an area like oncology. There are assays for many of the different types of cancer cells, and those enable you to look at what is going to be a rough epidemiology of a specific form of cancer in order to determine whether or not your discovery scientists are working in the right area, an area of high unmet need. So there's a lot of that where the guidance is guided by epidemiology. The epidemiology comes from what's out there, what is being measured, what is being captured in these databases.
Okay.
Maybe I'll give you one practical example of one of our portfolio companies, Cypher Medicine. We invested in a company that's speaking about molecular multiomics data, specifically focuses on transcriptomics data. And the company is focusing in particular on, they have built actually proprietary, one of the largest rheumatoid arthritis transcriptomic data pool. And actually thinking about the biomarkers, one avenue is diagnostics, the other one is predictive or prognostic biomarkers. And the company was able to identify a set of predictive biomarkers that are able to define whether the patient would respond to anti-TNFs. And now why real-world data is so important, because now in the clinical utility studies, they can take the data from the practice and compare how those clinical decision-making process, when supported by the predictive diagnostic test, is able to change the clinical outcome of the patients. And this is a very interesting kind of case study as to how predictive biomarkers in combination with real-world data and unique molecular omics, or in this case transcriptomics data set, can play together.
Absolutely. I mean, when I was at a venture capital fund prior to this role at AWS, we invested in a company that basically took an asset off the shelf because it found through real-world evidence that even though the trial wasn't that successful in general populations, it was for adenoid cystic carcinoma, but they found the patients that had a notch pathway indication, the therapy was actually quite effective. And so they were able to then now release that and use and get fast track from the FDA to actually serve that particular subset population and help those people. So, and again, without that access to real-world evidence, and this is going back to the question of how is it starting to impact our R&D. I want to just touch a little bit on the challenges we have around diversity in the data. Do you want to speak to that, Miriam?
Yeah, sure. Well, I've been saying it also in the morning that we have this so-called gender data gap, and that's not only related to healthcare, but in general, that we are missing lots of data based on products, services, research, studies, science, everything, comparing men and women, and there's just not that much for women. So we're missing this, and we need to run even more, invest even more research into women's health in order to close that gender data gap. I mean, what we're building is pretty much a product just for, we say, people that menstruate, but it's pretty much women. And what we have is data that is specifically for that group, so we help close that gap. But it's been historically neglected for a while, and it has specific reasons also that women weren't included in studies in the same amount, or we're just testing on male mice because they're more easy to test on and they don't have that hormonal differences. So yeah, there's still a lot to do, and I think it's just in general that it's great that we have that focus now, or we tend to have a little bit more focus in that field to develop products and then also maybe therapeutics and drugs that really are tested to what the patient needs and not just a general population.
What about other areas of diversity? Do we have a challenge in data in that area as far as you know?
Yeah, well, I think when you think of, the traditional randomized control trials, and, they tend to be in specific regions, specific hospitals, so then you tend to catch, the people which are within those regions. And I suppose then that can limit the diversity that you have within that data set, whereby if you're using real world evidence as well, that can, I suppose, broaden the scope, and it gives you, I suppose, more access to patients who wouldn't be limited to those regions where the randomized control trials are taking place. So I think it can really help with ensuring diversity within a clinical trial setting.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that. So, the FDA, mandates essentially certain levels of diversity in the clinical trials, and from the perspective of running those clinical trials, you can be much more intentional about achieving specific diversity goals imposed on you by the FDA through strategic selection of sites that are located in areas to ensure that you satisfy sort of diversity requirements. So by being intentional about it, the real world data enables you to be successful in the context of being intentional.
So you mentioned the FDA. What other role is there for policy and regulators to ensure that we're better using real-world evidence? Do you know?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak. Yeah, I think there is a recognition now across the regulatory bodies that this is a material evidence source, and yeah, it's based on observational data, but it can bolster that kind of randomized controlled trial type of data as well. And you're seeing the FDA coming out with guidelines on it. You're seeing the EU bodies coming out with guidelines on it. The MHRA coming out. I saw the UK government were putting policies in place where electronic health records providers actually had to provide APIs to their systems in order to enable other people to be able to interact with the electronic health records as well. So I think, from a governmental and a regulatory body point of view, there is momentum there. I think there is, still a way to go, but I think it's in the right place and it's going in the right direction.
So maybe to add to that.
Sure.
Getting diabetes drugs approved in the U.S. is very expensive. The reason that it's very expensive is because you need to make sure that they are less harmful and have at least as much of an impact on existing approved drugs, particularly in the cardiovascular space. Running a cardiovascular outcome study typically involves tens of thousands of patients because you're looking for rare events to actually happen. With real-world data, as long as the FDA is accepting of cardiovascular events that occur within, say, a claims database, then that can take a study that, a 10,000 patient study, which is going to cost you like $70, $80 million, and then reduce it down to the cost of the database that you have. And it's very easy to detect cardiovascular events within a claims database as long as you have specific criteria with respect to those. So it can basically take something that cost 70, 80 million, bring it down to $1 million, and enable you to get drugs approved.
So maybe just to complement a discussion, one of the areas where real-world data and real-world evidence, especially in the context of regulators, but also tapping into pharma, is the pricing of novel therapies, cell and gene therapies, because they really change the paradigm, the way we pay for healthcare patients. And there's the whole notion of health economic studies that were put into very vivid discussions. How do we price those therapies that are potentially one time or maybe 1 or 2 times per patient life? They're priced at even $2+ million per patient. And also similarly in terms of the novel cell therapies like CAR-T therapies that cost about $500,000 per patient. Where do we drive, how do we define the value per patient? This has to be shown in a real world evidence settings that there is the value captured for patient and for healthcare systems, and readjust the pricing of those therapies moving forward.
Yeah, one of the areas I want to pick up on, and I think that's super important, is in terms of qualities or in terms of how we judging whether a therapy is effective at improving and extending quality of life. But I want to get back to the topic of how it's contributing to R&D, and I started talking a little bit about orphan and rare diseases. Is there a role for real-world evidence to play in terms of synthetic control arms to help? And you touched on this with the cardiovascular example for diabetes, but is that really one of the main ways it's going to contribute to the R&D process?
So I think the answer is yes. There's challenges to it.
And please mention those challenges.
Yeah. So when you run a clinical trial, typically you will measure a specific thing over specific time periods, right? And then when you look at real-world evidence, typically it may or may not measure the thing that you want to that you need to measure. That would be your primary endpoint that your FDA would accept, and it may or may not do that over the entire patient population over time periods that are comparable to what you would need to do in a clinical trial. But I think as we get to things like Fitbits and that regularly measure things that are clinically significant over a continuous basis, then that enables us to do things like look at real progression of disease in contexts that may be more useful in the setting. But I would say that more pharmaceutical companies are now looking at in rare disease settings, bringing out the data, like any data that was involved in control arms, collaborating with other pharmaceutical companies to make that data available to basically bring down the costs associated with rare disease indications.
Cool. So let's talk about the future a bit. What are some of the blockers out there to collecting, or the challenges to collecting real-world evidence? How can we address them? And let's flash forward a bit. What's the future look like?
Yeah. So I think, a few things that is blocking it at the moment, whereby I think innovations can help. One of them is, as we all know, and I know it's been talked about earlier on other panels as well, is the fragmented data situation within healthcare, within silos, and being able to, I suppose, bridge those gaps is something that is really important to, I suppose, further the field of real-world evidence. So companies that are looking to do that, I think, can really kind of push the dial on that. And then I also think, I suppose, other kind of issues within real-world evidence at the moment also is they're in quite an unstructured format. It can be quite difficult to get insights from it. So advanced AI models at the moment, large language models, which are able to really ingest that information and create insights from it as well. I think that can really really help with being able to provide, I suppose, more insights within this space to push it forward.
I can say from our perspective as a cloud provider, we invest a lot in technologies like federated learning, which allows you to take advantage of real-world or evidence in hospital sites or research institutes without the data actually ever leaving the actual zone of the hospital. So there's a huge challenge around data residency, privacy, of course, and so through these kind of technologies, and then there are big companies and unicorns like Oaken who have a very, very amazing platform for federated learning. It's giving the research departments access to data they didn't have before because of regulation, but technology is now being able to sort of bridge that gap and actually make that data available. Because someone once told me that patient data today, and if you contribute your patient data to medical research, it's like you're contributing blood to a blood bank, right? It is integral, right? And so I think we're at the stage where some of these blockers are getting removed through these innovative federated learning technologies. But any other innovations that we have or blockers that we have and innovations, yeah?
Maybe I can also tell one example that I've experienced in the last couple of months is and I'm coming back to the lack of data and research that we have in the women's health field, is that, for example, running a study on endometriosis diagnosis it's super hard because it's such under-researched. We can't really define a control group of women that are healthy and that have it already diagnosed, because of those women that are not diagnosed, probably at least 10 to 20% still have it. So it's really a tricky problem where to start here.
And I think where there's a challenge, there is also an opportunity. So while we have a lot of technologies that capture data, I think the challenge / opportunity is, rather than starting with data, to your point of the companies in federated learning, is thinking about how we in the future look into a data collection and more from a perspective of a use case as to what problem we are trying to solve, and design the databases or the data infrastructure in such way that it captures really rich data sets around patient on multiple different layers. Because current models, they actually don't require huge data sets, but they require rich data sets. They require systematic and structured way of collecting those data, and that we have enough diversity within that data set as to be whatever we are trying to query versus the control data set. And I think there is also a lot of innovation going in this direction around the companies building novel data platforms that are purpose-built for the algorithms, like, for example, federated learning.
Yeah, maybe to add to that, so there's still an expertise gap, I would say. If the medical coders, 10 years ago, I think that the only thing that they would be, primarily, I think their employment was in, translating doctors' codes into things that would be reimbursed. And nowadays, I have medical coding expertise on my team because we need to translate the evidence that exists within the claims into epidemiological answers that will guide our research. And it's not just medical coding expertise, it's biostatistics. It's biostatistics in the context of the medical codes for specific indications. It's the ability to build a database, the ability to write SQL, the ability to translate the statistics into meaningful answers to questions that actually guide the overall epidemiology that guides their research.
Yeah, and there are some great startups, actually two by the name of Lynx, one from Israel, one from Belgium, doing almost the same thing, and they have the same name, which is kind of strange, that are providing hospitals and research institutes with the ability to make available and map the data that exist in the research institute, to give that and make that available to the outside world, not in terms of just putting the data out there, but saying, this is the data we have, researcher, do you want to use it? And even that process has proven very difficult for hospitals to do, right? To actually, you know, a pharma company who says, we need data on this patient subset, and then it's like, what, how? And then like maybe 7 months later, they'll find something. Whereas these kind of solutions are actually like, you know, there's a lot of startups out there trying to address that and make that access. Look, I'm aware that we have 3 minutes left. Does anyone have any sort of closing sort of things to sort of highlights or nuggets to share with the audience, either on this topic or perhaps something about your own work that you want to share, or a pitch? You've got an audience here, so I'm giving you that opportunity. I'm going to start with the startup on the stage because they need the most help. What are you looking for? How can this audience help you?
Well, we're as a startup, we're currently doing clinical studies. So if there's women in Berlin and that want to participate, you can always feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to receive menstrual blood samples. Other than that, we're also fundraising. So we're looking for funds. We're applying for grants, but also private money. Yeah, and then I would say spread the word and speak about menstruation and break the taboo that is still there.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's about as real as you can get, people. She's inviting you to send menstrual blood in. That's a real-world evidence collection pitch on the stage, but also please help them. That'd be great. The VCs, what are you looking for?
We are investors, so we're always looking for great companies to invest in. As Hitachi Ventures, we're a strategic investor, so we're looking at the companies that are close to Hitachi as a business, and that they are platform first, analytics first. Really, we're quite broad when it comes to the specific use cases. So really looking forward to connecting.
Ruth?
Yeah, so similarly, investor looking for ambitious founders at the seed, Series A stage, and we invest in UK-based businesses, so need to have a UK presence. So need to have, you know, some boots on the ground within the UK. But yeah, we're quite broad in what we look for within the health tech and life sciences space. So yeah, anything interesting within that area, please do find me and speak.
Great, and Bill?
Yeah, so my company, we were formed actually a couple of months ago. We consolidated all the subsidiaries of Sumitomo Pharma in the U.S. into a single entity. Prior to that, my group came out of a startup company called Roivant. Many of you may be familiar with the former CEO who is now running for president in the Republican Party in the U.S. But so that company was focused on identifying high-value assets, drugs that are in clinical stage, to bring them through to approval. Because of our startup culture, I think we formed a technology-forward group that has enabled differentiated application of technology in the context of clinical trials and commercialization of drugs. We are looking for partnerships that will enable us to improve our pipeline, and we think our differentiated approach improves the probability of success of drugs in clinical stage.
Thank you very much. And at AWS, we're looking to work with, in our startup group, any startups out there that are looking to build their technology and build their platform so that we can help you get to your results and your science faster and shorten the time to clinical value. Thank you very much to the panelists. Please, big round of applause.
Joanna, Miriam, Ruth, Bill, and Guy, thank you very much for excellent moderation. Thank you again.